So much happening. I'm glad that Dr. Steve Pieczenik of StevePieczenik.com, co-author with Tom Clancy, many books, best-selling author in his own right, worked with major intelligence agencies, psychological operations, Delta Force, you name it, here to talk about the waterfront. This General Kelly appointment to Chief of Staff, he was calling for this back when Trump was candidate Trump, right after he got the nomination in July. So he's joining us to talk about that, to talk about the internal battles that are going on. Let me raise this with Dr. Steve Pieczenik. I know he's not a Russophile. In fact, he helped bring down the Soviet Union. But they're becoming more Christian, more free market. They're battling radical Islam. They've worked with the military against the Arab Spring that the traitors of the government, like Obama and Hillary, openly engaged in. So there's been an internal civil war for 6 years with our own military and patriots saying we're not going to go along with your Arab Spring. So when they say there's a Russian connection, it's there that we've worked with the Russians. We broke that 6 years ago, 5 years ago. Cy Hirsch came on last year, confirmed that we were right. We had general knowledge from a lot of sources in the government. We had Colonel Schaefer. We, of course, have had folks on like Tosh Plumley. We've had folks involved, obviously, with Benghazi on. We've had Steve Pieczenik on, all documenting up front what really happened at Benghazi, what's happened since then. And so if you want to find Russian collusion, it's Russia working with, I guess, our patriotic deep state. There's more than one deep state, obviously, to not actually merge with radical Islam and then double-cross the American people as the EU has done their own population. So that's the basics from my perspective. What comes in now is I see one of Trump's failures is he's being bullied by the media and by the other side of the deep state into new sanctions against Russia, into a military stance against Russia, into an acceleration of already bad blood into even worse to prove he's not in bed with the Russians. And the more he starts fights with the Russians, the more we get into a posture of aggression, the worse they bully the president, claiming these non-existent Russia ties. So I just don't like seeing the tail wag the dog here of Hollywood, MSM, the Democrats, the neocons, the rhinos, trying to destroy the good foreign policies I see out of Trump on other areas into making Russia public enemy number one. I don't know Dr. Pieczenik's view on this. We'll get it right now. Doc?
The truth of the matter is, for some time, as you correctly stated, from the very beginning of the Trump nomination, I said the first things would have to go would be the political operatives. Corey Lewandowski's an excellent operative. He's still involved, although he had to leave. But the ones who are not excellent, or the ones who were thrown out, Spicer and Priebus. The reason for that is they're really not qualified to run a complex system. The reason General Kelly came in, and we had McMaster, we had Mattis, we have about 6, 7 generals now who are involved in the central command of the White House and other important agencies, including the CIA with Pompeo, is that they're used to efficiency, they're used to effectiveness. They know very well that Russia is not our enemy. Now, what is happening is you've got, again, the ineffectual Republican Party, which couldn't pass Obamacare or couldn't repeal it, couldn't do anything. They had only 7 years to learn about it. They had 7 years to be able to improve it, and they proved to be totally incompetent. Again, Ryan, McClain, McClellan, and our friend McCain. So what we have there is complete incompetency. Now, beneath that element of the so-called kabuki of politics is really what we concern the deep state, or what I call the honorable deep state. And they, in effect, are doing exactly what they were supposed to do and what I've been saying for a long time. Number one, we have had no discussion of the fact that Mattis and our generals in Iraq have been incredibly effective at taking down ISIS. The Russians know this. The Iranians have noticed this. What we have now is a problem that in 5 days we had a phased attack into Mosul, and it was incredibly effective. You have heard nothing but nothing from the press about the phased victory in Mosul. The second part is that Iran had been our ally, and now they're beginning to turn against us. So once we went into Mosul and we effectively took down ISIS, then the Iranians are starting to fight with us. Now, this is a conundrum. This is not something I expect the politicians to understand. I don't expect Congress to understand it. I think for the most part, they're really ineffectual.
Sure. I mean, they don't understand that if you've got this battle of all these different armies together over this key area of this gateway to Europe, to be able to blackmail Europe and control the new pipelines and the rest of it, that as soon as we began to kick out the Saudi, Qatari, Wahhabist faction, that Iran that we've been allied with would obviously try to double cross and come into that vacuum. But we have a 5-year, 6-year deal. Assad needs to reportedly move towards an open election now. Iran needs to move out, and we need to move towards democratizing Syria, correct?
Right. Now, what's important, and you hit it on the head, Alex, and you're one of the few to discuss it. What's important now is that our forces are acting as a peacekeeping force in northern Syria. I've talked about it before. They're separating Erdogan's Turkish forces, who were our allies, as well as the Kurds, who did an incredible job. The YPG, primarily they're women fighters, and they were excellent.
Exactly. So if you have 5 factions, that's why I use the Hobbit analogy, 5 factions, they're going to want to pour back in. How long will we have to be there, though, for this to be stabilized?
Unfortunately, as I've said before, it's easier to create war. That was started by Bush Jr. and Cheney and the neocons. It's much harder to end a war. And I must give credit to our generals, all of them, Mattis, McMaster, Vodal, the head of special forces, because they are doing a yeoman's job, not in terms of kinetic killing, but in terms of negotiating and arbitrating peace treaties. And Rex Tillerson has done an excellent job in decreasing the size of the State Department. And in turn, because he was head of ExxonMobil, he knows all the Sunni and Shiite players. Now, to get something straight, what happened with Putin was, okay, Trump went along with these incompetent politicians in Congress who placed a misplaced sanction on the Russians. But the Russians are very clever, so is Trump. What we did not do was to allow our businesses to withdraw from Russia. In other words, our major businesses in the gas and the oil and in Air Force and whatever other material that Putin needs are still going forth. And what really happened, Putin said, well, I'm going to withdraw 722 American staff members of our Russian embassy. Meanwhile, in Moscow, there was never a great embassy. I worked out of there. I never really used it. I worked in the field.
So Trump's having to do this for face saving, but the truth is there are certain global economic interests that want to be able to dictate who and can't go into Russia. And instead, the real way to continue to accelerate the reforms in Russia is to continue the free market connections with the West.
You had it right on the head, Alex. And what's happening is we're allowing the free markets to go in. So whatever sanctions we may have against a particular oligarch and all, that's part of the kabuki. The 722 people are really primarily Russian citizens who work in a non-secure area in the embassy. So this is all a kabuki. The reality is our intelligence, CIA, other intelligence units always work with the Russians, have always. Our military have always worked with the Russians because they have to. We're in Syria. It's a complicated situation. The Russians are very effective in what they do. Our military is very effective in what they do. And in turn, a general like Mattis, the Defense Department Def, says, look, we got a problem in Africa. And even Petraeus came forth and a lot of other generals who were involved saying, we can't give aid to every major leader of a dysfunctional country in Africa. So what Trump has allowed the military to do is not only to be in the kinetic part, which is a minor part, but to be in really the negotiation, the strategy, and the literal...
And they're having real strategy now. What do you make of the headlines that they're having debates about fully withdrawing from Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's important. From my point of view, that was a war that was started by a neocon by the name of Zalmay Khalilzad, who worked with me on the West Bank.
And it's totally the longest running war in U.S. history.
Correct. But it was started by that CIA that wanted some kind of things to get involved. Afghanistan has no strategic value to us. It's really an extension of Pakistan and the ISI, or the Inter-Service Intelligence Agency. For us, the real issues that are important are going to be China, Russia, to get out of the Middle East and pivot to where we need to pivot, which is really to Southeast Asia and to the China Sea, as well as monitor.
Exactly, but the Chinese propagandists through our media really want to keep us in the Middle East.
That's correct. Now you hit it on the, I think you're the best strategist. You hit it right on the head.
Oh, no, I can see the strategy, and I can see Trump on every front following strategies that make sense for America, for prosperity, and for peace. I want to understand tyranny. As corrupt people get into governing systems, they like to steal, they like to cheat, they like to manipulate, they don't like to actually build things. They bring in more people to build their empire, and at a certain point, it drives out all the producers, and you collapse like Venezuela is right now. But you look at the incredible production power of modern societies, it allows the baubles and things to keep flowing, and now with the robots coming in, will we reach a point where, despite the fact that we have incredible corruption and waste, that the kind of automated systems take over, and so you've got these insane, mentally ill people on power trips kind of running things. They're the ghosts in the machine, and then now the mistakes that normally would just kick them out of power manifest as giant wars or crises that get magnified or exacerbated once they actually get triggered, because they get held off so long and papered over by the advances we've made as a civilization. Or do the advances expose them and bring them down faster? I mean, I don't think anyone knows the answer to this, but a lot of the top billionaires themselves are moving to very remote areas. They're very paranoid. They believe things are going to collapse. Dr. Pieczenik is an optimist. What do you think is going to happen?
I think your latter point was right on the head. What's happening, and I've said it from day one, and you and I discussed it, and you thought I was a genius when I said it, but I'm still saying it's a devolution of power. The federal government is becoming more and more irrelevant. That's why the Rex Tillersons can come in, they can cut the State Department. They're 20,000 people. I could honestly say I could work with the State Department with about 10 people. Kissinger did that, Baker did that, almost everybody else. It's the same issue that Kelly will come in, he will cut the staff 50% or even more. The bottom line is very simple. None of our politicians, either Republican or a Democrat, have ever really created a company or built anything. And the truth of the matter is America's waiting for the infrastructure. And that's the one thing I would say to Trump and to Kelly. Get rid of all the other nonsense. Let's start putting in money into the infrastructure. I don't know why Obamacare came up first. I don't know why anything else came up first. You have to get into the infrastructure. The minute we get into infrastructure, you will see the power of the different states, the counties, and the American people. Now, you got to remember also, at this present time, the economy is so good that we have a 2% growth rate. We should get to 4%. But at the same time, we have the lowest unemployment ever. That had nothing to do with Congress. That has nothing to do with the Senate. It has everything to do with the fact that we have small business people. automation will present a very serious problem. And that problem is for the millennials and others, because we're going to have to get into a gig economy or GIG economy where an individual who's a millennial will have to have more than one job. I just met a young man, an African-American who's 20 years old. He has a talent management agency. He has something else. He's involved in the National Guard. He has 2 or 3 businesses, and he's only 20 years old. But he's effective. The same theater down in the South, I see young people building up companies faster than anyone can imagine. The fact of Hollywood, they're finished. They can't make these 5-minute infomercials. They can't make a 5-minute spot on the internet. So what happened with the internet, and our military and DARPA understood it, we broke up the federal government. And that's why, in effect, our military understood this better than anyone. It's not an accident. I was trained in 1972 by Defense Advanced Research Project Agency.
Tell you what, back in
DARPA,
70 seconds. I want to hear about this in 70 seconds. We're starting to win, but we're in one hell of a fight. Dr. Pieczenik was finishing up getting into the internet was designed, the bureaucrats believe, to take full control, but instead it's empowering the people. They're trying to bring in censorship tools right now, so the battle over the future of the freedom of speech, not just the web, is happening now. But getting back to Dr. Pieczenik, who first predicted these net wars and cyber wars 30-something years ago in his books, break down where you think we're currently at and the points you were trying to make.
Well, what I'm trying to make is that the government itself is devolving. We don't need very much government anymore. And basically what's happening, we're going to the local government, the governors, the commissioners. For example, in the government, we have cyber issues. But if you have Proofpoint, the corporation, who's the only one that can do quantum encryption, which is a fancy way of saying that they can handle ransomware that's coming all over the world, as opposed to what the government can do in cyber command.
Things have to be small, they have to be fast moving, they have to be divided up, or they can be infiltrated.
Well, yeah, but again, we're talking about a mass of people. When you're attacking HBO, they're finished. When you're talking Fox, you're talking about the sons of a man who was 88 years old. They're not relevant. When you're talking about TV, they're not relevant. When you're talking about movies, they're not relevant. So what's relevant? Twitter. You have become relevant because that's where they want to go to alternative news media. What's relevant? Proofpoint, a corporation that has quantum encryption that's way beyond anything we've ever had in the government, because we don't have the ability to fight the malware. What else is relevant? We are a formidable force. We can make a company in 24 hours, an LLC, and start it up. You can't do that in England. We can't do that in France. You can't do that in China. You can't do that anywhere in the EU. So what's happening, the EU will eventually break up. Brexit will occur. Scotland wants to go with the EU. Russia is already allying itself with China and the United States, irrespective of what anybody else says. Africa is a point of strategic interest for China and ourselves. The Chinese just built a 400 railroad from Djibouti to Ethiopia. So what's happening is we're coming back to what I call the 16th century Dutch model, where the growth is going around the world and what the Chinese call the one belt, one road. And so they understand they don't want a conflict with the United States. North Korea doesn't want conflict with the United States. All that missile stuff is junk. That's just show. Because underneath it, he understands if we take away his missiles, then we're going to do to him what we did to Gaddafi and what we did to Saddam Hussein. And most leaders don't like that. So they don't trust the United States. It's not an issue we're going to war with them. We don't want war. We don't need the war. But we have force structures that can prevent it. Strategic, mutual assured destruction, we know in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that it was involved, has worked, and we don't want to go to war. They don't want to go to war. We're not going to have a nuclear war. Where we will have problems, and this is what I've said for a long time, are the places where the media and the government hasn't looked at, and that's between China and India. Those two powerhouses each have over 1 billion people, need water. And right now they have skirmishes over Bhutan, Bhutan, which is a small country, but they've been fighting there. Now, you don't have any exposure of that in the news. Why? Because they're not very bright. Most of the people...
There's also almost no coverage of ISIS and Al-Qaeda being 99% destroyed.
No,
huge
correct.
victory.
So you explain it to me. If you ran a cable network or you ran the New York Times and you had no coverage of the fact that ISIS was destroyed in Mosul, ISIS is being destroyed in Raqqa, what kind of a paper are you? And now you're seeing India watching China's bid to court Bhutan, right? And that's basically going into war. So all of the things that attacked you, you have to look at and say, wow, maybe I need more people to attack me, because you're the key element and you're the person.
Well, I appreciate you being positive and trying to cheer me up. I know that. I'm celebrating it. I absolutely love it. Thank you, Dr. Steve Pieczenik.